All right, we'll go ahead and let the children be dismissed to junior church. We'll give them just a minute to do this. I have to admit, it's been almost a decade since I've been up here. So a little nervous. You know, I actually had a pretty good role model growing up. My dad is here this morning. I grew up listening to him preach and learned a couple things from him. Number one, I'm kind of glad we don't have a pulpit because a chained dog is no threat. I like to wander around a little bit when I talk, so I won't be standing behind a pulpit. The second thing is that the mind can only comprehend what the seat can endure. So we'll try not to make this too long this morning. No, I don't need that. So let's just jump right into this, shall we? We're going to be looking at the last chapter of the last gospel, specifically the last half of that last chapter of the last gospel. So John chapter 21. Let's start with a bit of context. I think it was Walter Martin. I don't know if you know who he was. He was the Bible answer man way back when. But he said that any text without a context tends to become a pretext. So we've already read the scripture this morning, and I think all of us know that story where Jesus says to Peter, "Do you love me?" I think we've all heard that. But let's go back and look at some context. This is probably about a week after Jesus was resurrected from the dead, and the disciples were still reeling. Kind of put yourself in their shoes, what they had been through just the weekend before. They thought that Jesus was the Messiah. And, you know, it's easy for us because we have hindsight. We can look back and we can understand that Jesus died for more than just the Jewish people. That being the Messiah was more about just restoring Israel. His disciples probably would not have been able to grasp that because they were taught from childhood that when the Messiah comes, he is going to restore Israel. That Israel will once again not only be a great nation, they will be the nation on earth. And that the Messiah will reign forever. They believed that Jesus was the Messiah. They wholeheartedly believed that. They were probably younger than Jesus, we'll give them that, but they were adults. They had lives. At one point, and I think it's in one of the letters we read that Peter had a mother-in-law, so he was married. We had a person who was a tax collector, he had a career. There was a physician who left his career to follow Jesus. All of these men, when Jesus said, "Come follow me," they gave up their lives. They dropped everything to follow this. They were completely convinced that Jesus was the Messiah, and now he was dead. Now he had been crucified. The worst death that anybody could imagine, and he went through it. And then on Sunday, the women get up and go to the grave, and the reason they go to the grave on Sunday morning is because the body hadn't been prepared yet. According to Jewish custom, Sabbath began on sundown on Friday night. So you didn't do anything from sundown Friday night until sundown Saturday night. And by the time they got Jesus off the cross and put in the grave, there was no time to prepare his body for burial. So they come back on Sunday morning, the women, and the tomb is empty. And they don't know what to make of it. So they run back and they get the disciples and they tell Peter and John first. And of course, Peter being Peter, you got to love Peter. What do you mean the tomb is empty? And he just takes off. And he runs full speed to the tomb and it's empty. Can you imagine what must be going through his mind? Not only has the Messiah been crucified and killed, but now somebody's taken his body too. And then that night, they're all gathered together, and I can't imagine that the mood was very cheerful. It must have been somber. You know, maybe there was some reminiscing going on. The scene that kind of popped in my mind as I was preparing for this was actually from The Waterboy. I don't know if you've ever seen that. But have you ever seen The Waterboy? There's a scene towards the end of the movie where Bobby Boucher, the hero of the story, he's not able to play in the final game because his grades aren't good enough. So they're just getting whipped. They're in the bowl game, they're getting whipped by this really good team, and then one of them says, "You remember that time that Bobby did this and this and the other thing?" And they all laugh. "You remember that time that Bobby did this?" And they all kind of laugh. And then Bobby comes up, "You remember that time Bobby Boucher showed up and the Bud Dogs won the Bourbon Bowl?" I can imagine it was kind of like that, where they're saying, "Remember that time that Jesus got onto those tax collectors? You remember that time when the Pharisees tried to trap him and Jesus just flat out outwitted him? And then there's Jesus. Remember the time that Jesus came back from the dead? And Jesus was among them. He said, look at my hands. Look at my side. I'm alive and I'm with you. But he never really goes into detail about what they're supposed to do. So he appears to him that night, and he appears to him about a week later, and we know that's the Thomas story where Thomas says, I'm not going to believe unless I can put my fingers in his hands, put my hand in his side. I think we know that story too. But it was sometime after that. So we're talking about almost a week, a little over a week later. And Peter, being Peter is impulsive. Peter does not sit still. I imagine Peter probably had ADD. He was impulsive. He let his mouth run ahead of his mind. He was not the kind of person to just sit around and do nothing. He had to be doing something. So he said, you know what, guys, until we get some further instruction, I'm going fishing. Who's with me? So that's what they do. A few guys come with Peter and they go fishing. And it's just like old times. Peter was a fisherman, but I'm not sure he was a very good fisherman. The only time we ever read about him catching anything is when Jesus tells him to throw the net on the certain side of the boat. So they fish all night, just like old times, and they catch nothing, just like old times. And they're just getting ready to come back in. They're a few hundred yards from shore, and there's somebody on the beach asking the one question that every fisherman hates. You catch anything? No. Been fishing all night, didn't catch a thing. And John is the sharp one here. I imagine the hair on the back of John's neck is starting to stand up at this point, but Peter, probably not. He's just tired and disappointed he didn't catch anything. No, we didn't catch anything. Throw your net to starboard. You'll catch something. And the hair on John's neck stands up a little more. Well, Peter's like, oh, what have we got to lose? Throw the nets. And they throw the nets. And they begin to haul in a net full of fish that's so heavy that they can't bring it in. They physically cannot bring it over the side of the boat. And now John's convinced. Peter, that's Jesus. And then it clicks in Peter's mind, and then Peter, being Peter, he grabs his outer garment, wraps it around himself, and he's in the water. He's not waiting to get back to the shore. And they have breakfast with Jesus on the shore. So that's where we are in this chapter, where we find Jesus. He's had breakfast with the group of disciples who were there. And then we get into the Peter, do you love me? What I really want to focus on is after he says this, after he goes through the Peter, do you love me? Take care of my lambs, feed my sheep. He says, follow me. And Peter says, well, what about John? Jesus says, what about John? You have to follow me. As Christians, that's what we're supposed to do. That's what being a Christian is. It's following Jesus. We have been called to follow Christ. But what does that look like? I think there's some misconceptions about what it looks like to follow Jesus, and that's what I want to go over this morning a bit. First misconception I want to talk about is that to follow Jesus, you have to be perfect. No, you don't. I want you to think about this. If you had to be perfect to follow Jesus, how many followers would Jesus have? 0. Take it a step further. If you had to be perfect to follow Jesus, Jesus would not have had to come to die to begin with because people would be perfect. It would be possible to be perfect without him. Jesus does not expect us to be perfect. So does that mean that we can just do whatever we want to do? As Paul later said, by no means. Do we continue to sin that grace may abound? Of course not. Of course not. What it does mean is that our intentions should be perfect. Your intentions should be perfect. Your actions don't have to be perfect, but your intentions should be perfect. What does that look like? How many of you have ever raised teenagers? Anybody? I've got 3 of them. Yeah, it's an amazing thing that happens when you have teenagers. One night they go to bed and they wake up, and suddenly overnight they have learned everything there is to know about everything. And another amazing thing happens, their parents have forgotten everything. Mom and Dad don't know everything, I do. And then about 10 years down the road, they wake up again and they realize, wow, I'm just amazed at how much my parents managed to learn in 10 years. But teenagers are defiant. They're at that age where they're pushing boundaries. They're not always doing what they know they should do. They cross the boundaries on purpose. When I say that our intentions should be perfect, what I mean is that we don't do things that we know are wrong. It sounds simple, but it's really not. We don't do the things that we know are wrong, but we do the things that we know are right, and that can be hard too. Following Christ means that even if it's something that I really, really want to do, if it's wrong, I don't do it because I want to follow Christ. Does that mean I'm not going to ever mess up? Of course not. This last, what was it, almost a year ago now, Elisha was learning how to drive. And of course, Madison knows all about this. But we were trying to teach her how to drive, and the only way to teach a teenager how to drive is to get him behind the wheel. So she had gone to work with Heather, and we let her drive around the storage units. Figured they're nice straight lanes. There's curves there. She can learn to go around turns. She pulls up to the gate one time, and she mixes up which one is the gas pedal and which one's the brake pedal. She proceeded to turn our Ford Flex into a Dodge Ram. Out right into the side of the gate. When they called me, you know what Elisha was worried about? She wasn't worried about the gate. She wasn't worried about Heather's job. She wasn't worried about the Ford Flex. She was worried about whether or not her dad was going to be angry with her. I wasn't angry with her. It was a mistake. It was an accident. It's going to happen. Now, if she had taken the keys and snuck out in the middle of the night and taken the Flex for a joyride and gotten in an accident, I would have been right upset. Do you understand the difference between perfection of actions and perfection of intent? We don't have to be perfect to follow Christ. Peter was not perfect. The disciples were not perfect. Peter, like I said, was impulsive. He tended to let his mouth get ahead of his brain. I don't think any of the disciples was ever rebuked more than Peter. Seems like every time he turned around, Peter was saying something stupid, and Jesus was saying, would you just calm down? Follow Jesus means that our intent should be perfect. We should strive to do what is right and to not do what is wrong. The second misconception is that following Jesus means I need to check all the boxes. And those of you who have grown up in the Church of Christ, I think you understand what the boxes are. Go to church on Sunday, check. We have church on Sunday night, check. We have church on Wednesday, check. Got to make sure we take communion, check the box. Those of you who grow up in the Church of Christ, you can name the other boxes probably better than I can. And it's a trap. We fall into this trap that thinking that following Christ means I just have to check all these boxes. And I've talked to more than one person who says that they were afraid that if they didn't check all the boxes that they were going to end up going to hell. But look at the way that Jesus called people. That's just not the way it was. When Jesus called Peter, he didn't say, okay, Peter, here's a list. Here you go. Just check off all these boxes and you'll go to heaven. You want to follow me? Just check off these boxes and we're good. That probably would have been more acceptable to Peter because that's pretty much what the Jewish tradition was about. It was about law. You had 100 and some odd different laws, and it was about following every one of them to the letter. That's not what following Jesus was about. Islam is like that. Islam is very much that when you die, Allah looks at everything good that you've done and everything bad that you've done, and if your good outweighs your bad, then you're allowed to go to heaven. But you can never really know for sure. About checking those boxes. Pray however many times a day, check. Make sure you only eat certain food, check. Hindu is kind of like that. Hindu believes in karma. I think everybody's heard of karma. If you do good things will come back to you. If you do bad things will come back to you. They believe that if you do good things in this life, that you'll be reincarnated into a better life. And if you continue to do good things in life after life after life, eventually you'll end up in nirvana, which is what they call heaven. Christianity is not about checking boxes. Christianity is about wholeheartedly following Jesus. It's not about what we have done. It's about what Jesus did for us, and that's what sets Christianity apart from any other religion. Most religions have it that it's all about me. It's about what I do. It's about following the rules and making sure that I check all those boxes. Christianity is about Jesus already having checked all those boxes for you. What he did on the cross covers it. It's not about what we do. It's about what he already did and about the gift that he is offering us. The third misconception that I want to talk about, and probably the most important, and this is really rampant, especially in the South, is that following Jesus means that I'm going to be happy. Following Jesus is easy, that it means my life is going to be easy. Friends, that is a downright lie. Nowhere in the Bible will you ever find where Jesus says, "Come follow me and I'll just make your life peachy keen." Never. You know what it does say? In this world you will have trouble. But fear not, because I've overcome the world. You know what it does say? People, if they hate you, if they despise you, remember that they despised me first. It does say that when people despise and reject you, rejected me first. And they're going to do all kinds of evil to you because of me. Following Jesus does not mean that our life is going to be easy, not by a long shot. It does mean that Christ is going to be there with us. I think if we look at this, we can look at Scripture and we can see that Jesus not only meets the physical needs of people, he meets the emotional needs of people as well. If you haven't seen The Chosen, I'd recommend that you watch it. That first season was just amazing. And there's a scene in there in the Bible, I think it takes place in the book of Mark, but there's a leper who comes to Jesus shortly after the Sermon on the Mount. Leprosy was a horrible thing. They didn't understand disease the way that we do. You and I probably know more about the human body and about disease than anybody in those times did. And if Madison were to go back to those times, I mean, the things that he would know about the human body, they probably would not even be able to accept because it would be so foreign to them. The only thing that they knew about leprosy is, number one, you're going to die. Number two, it's contagious somehow. They didn't know how it spread, but they knew that it spread. So if you had leprosy, that was a form of living death. You had to say goodbye to your family. To your family, it was as if you already died. You were sent out into exile. You had to survive however you could. Some of them survived by begging. Who knows how they survived? Probably didn't survive for very long. So this man with leprosy approaches Jesus and he says, "Jesus, if you're willing, I can be made clean." And I want you to pay attention to what Jesus does. Jesus, it was very well within his power to say, "Very well, you're clean." And he would have been healed on the spot, just like that. But this was a man who had not felt a human touch for weeks, possibly even months or a year. Can you imagine going a year without any physical contact from anyone? And Jesus approached the man and he put his hands on him. For a man to touch a leper was one thing, but Jesus knew that this man needed to be touched. And he put his hands on him and he said, "I am willing. Be clean." He knew that that man needed that emotionally. He needed more than just physical healing. He needed some emotional healing as well. You can see it at the death of Lazarus. When Jesus finally arrives, he could have arrived earlier, but he didn't. And Martha comes to Jesus first, and she says, Jesus, if you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died. And Jesus said, it's okay. It's okay. He's going to be resurrected. And Martha says, I know at the end of all things that he's going to be resurrected, but if you'd have been here, he wouldn't have died. And he said, Martha, you don't understand. I'm the resurrection and the life. He had a logical conversation with her because that's what Martha needed. Martha was a logical, down-the-earth kind of person. But then here comes Mary, and she is just absolutely distraught. She doesn't need a logical explanation from Jesus. She comes to Jesus and she says, Jesus, if you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died. And how does Jesus respond to her? Even though he knows that in just a few moments he's going to raise Lazarus from the dead, he weeps with her. He grieves with her because that's what Mary needed in that moment. Emotionally, she needed that. And I think when we get to this point in the last part of John, this is what Peter needed emotionally. This is not about Jesus having to make things right with Peter. He did that on the cross. I think this is related to Peter denying Christ, but not because Jesus had to make it right, but because it was for Peter's sake that it had to be made right. It was the 800-pound gorilla in the room. Imagine that Easter night when Jesus appeared among them and Peter is thinking, betrayed him. Maybe Peter couldn't even look at him. I swore that I wouldn't betray him, and I betrayed him. And I think on the beach that kind of came to a head where Jesus said, I'm going to make this right. Let's get this 800-pound gorilla out of the room. Peter, do you love me? Yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Feed my lambs. Hey, Peter, do you love me? I mean, really love me. Do you love me? Yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Feed my sheep. Then he says it a third time, and I think that's probably when it clicked in Peter's mind that I betrayed him 3 times, and now Jesus has asked me 3 times. Peter, do you love me? And Peter says, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. Take care of my sheep. What Peter needed in that moment. Following Christ does not mean that our lives are going to be easy, but it doesn't mean that we have to go through it alone either. I know what it is to go through dark times. I've been there. More than once in my life, I've lost everything. I know what it is to have a marriage fall apart despite your best attempts to save it. I know what it is to lose a career that you love and to never be able to go back to it. I know what it is to be accused of something that you didn't do and have to pay the price for somebody else's actions. I've been in times that are so dark that I can't even see the light, that I wonder if God really even cares about me. I've been there. And I imagine some of you have been there too. Maybe when a loved one dies and we think, how am I going to live without this person? Or when somebody gets close to you, somebody who close to you is sick and you know they're not going to get better, and you're thinking, does Jesus really even care about how I feel? Well, we have to remember, and this is what really helped me out of this state of mind. Going on a year ago now, somebody who was very dear to me passed away. And he was with me in a time when it was really hard. But he used to say to me, Rob, now it's not always. Now is not always. I want you to think about that. When we go through these hard times in life, it is temporary. It is temporary. What is our life, this 70, 80, 90, 100 years? What is that compared to eternity? It's nothing. As a songwriter said, it's a wave tossed on the ocean. It's a vapor in the wind. We go through these dark times and it's so hard to see the light. We need to remember that now it's not always going to be like this. Why should we follow Christ if it's going to be hard? Because it's worth it. It is worth it. Jerry Don talked about this last week a little bit. He touched on it. We're going to go from John chapter 1 to Revelation 21. And I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the old heaven and the old earth had passed away. And God's dwelling will be with men, with people. And they will be His people, and He will be their God, and He will wipe every tear from their eye. It's worth it. And that is not temporary. That is forever. It's not going to be easy to follow Christ, but it is worth it. It's not easy to go through those hard times, but it's worth it. I don't know where you are in your walk with Christ. Maybe some of you have been on that journey for a long time and you've been following Christ for a long time. I want to encourage you to keep following. When those dark times hit, don't give up. Because in the end, it's worth it. Maybe you started following Christ, but you've fallen away. You don't follow Christ the way you used to. I want to encourage you to start following again. It's never too late to follow Christ. Remember, you don't have to be perfect to follow Christ. The important thing is that you follow Him. So if you've fallen away, if you don't follow Christ like you used to, I encourage you to follow again. Maybe you've never followed Christ. Maybe there's somebody in this room who's never made that decision. I'm not going to lie to you and tell you that it makes your life easy. It doesn't. But it's worth it. It's worth it. We'll have elders. Any one of the elders will be in the back here after this meeting. And if you want to follow Christ, I'm sure they would love to talk to you about it. What does it mean to follow Christ? What did it mean when Jesus asked those who followed Him to follow Him? It means you need to be willing to give up everything. Following Jesus is not a 50-50 thing. It's an all or nothing thing. You can't have your heart divided. There were multiple times that people came to Jesus and they went away empty because they couldn't give up what they needed to give up to follow Him. I think of one person who said, "Let me go bury my father first and then I'll follow you." And Jesus essentially said, "Man, it's now or never." Or we know the story about the rich young ruler who came to Jesus and said, "What do I have to do to be saved?" And Jesus said, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself." And the rich young man said, "I've done that. I've done that my whole life." Jesus said, "Good. And one thing you still lack. Go and sell all of your belongings and give it to the poor and come follow me." And the ruler went away because he had great wealth. He was very upset. He wasn't willing to give up everything to follow Jesus. There was a man back in the 1950s. His name was Jim Elliot. He felt that God had led him to be a missionary in South America. And not just to any South American tribe, to a tribe that was renowned for killing anyone who set foot on their land. But he said this. He said, and I want you to think about this. Carry this with you this week. I really want to put this in your mind and think about this. Jim Elliot said, "He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose." He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose. Following Christ means that I'm going to give up everything to follow Jesus. If he requires my wealth, he can have it. If he requires my relationships, he can have them. If he requires my job, he can have it. If he requires anything that I think belongs to me, he can have it. It doesn't mean that God is going to take everything from you. It means that you have to be willing to let it go in order to follow him. Following Jesus means that I'm going to follow, no matter what it costs me. We're going to go into our communion time this morning. Think of the price that Jesus paid for us. What he asks in return is not anything less than that we follow him. So as we eat this bread and we drink this juice, let's do it as a commitment to following Jesus. Let's do it as a way of saying, thank you for the price that you paid for me. I'm going to follow you. Let's pray. Lord, following you is not easy. It's not easy. We're surrounded by all these things in the world, all these things that are right in front of us, and you ask us to follow you even though we can't see you. We go through so many hard times in this life, and we think that following you is going to make things easier, and it doesn't. Lord, help us to remember that it's worth it. Help us to remember that now is not always. Help us to remember that no matter what we have in this life, it's not worth keeping if it's not going to last for eternity. Father, as we eat this bread and we drink this juice, help us to be mindful of the price that your Son paid for us. I ask this in Jesus' name.